Please be seated. There are two large crowds heading toward the city of Nain this morning in Galilee. One crowd approaching is led by Jesus. The crowd departing is led by a widow who's nameless, whose only son has just died. Two crowds representing two powerful forces coming together, colliding with each other outside the gates of Nain. I want you to imagine this widow joined with a procession of mourners. Her young son is on a funeral bier. As the funeral procession moves forward toward the gate, she grieves. She carries the grief of a parent who's lost a child. As she walks, we can imagine her saying, "Why, God? Why me? Have you abandoned me in the midst of all this? Where are you now?" Because without a male heir, her property, her home, goes to her husband's family. So she becomes destitute, without a safety net. And we can imagine her feeling numb inside, even dead. In fact, this funeral may feel like her funeral. But meanwhile, coming into town is a crowd following Jesus. We've just heard he's healed the centurion's slave. This is a man who's talking about loving God, loving neighbor. He's healing people. People are starting to have hope. They're believing. They're hopeful about the future in this man that they see. Is he a prophet, they wonder? A life march is heading into town. A death march goes out. And I wonder if either group is really prepared for the collision that's about to take place. It seems like this image, right, of life and death meeting each other is something we might want to sit with, because we're not real comfortable with sitting with death, are we? We like to turn away from it quickly, avoid it. But sometimes we miss the beauty in it too when we do that. And it makes me think about when I was a kid. Maybe many of you all remember, I don't know what we did, but I would sit in the back of a station wagon, my family's station wagon, and as we would go past a cemetery, we had this little thing we would do. We would hold our breath, and then everybody would say, "Everybody's dying to go there." We'd hold our breath till we got to the end. I don't know. I have no idea why we did that. And then another thing that we would do is, I think you all remember, and still we see it today, but just it seems like less, when a funeral procession would come through town, maybe around the neighborhood from one church to the cemetery, I would be fascinating watching the policemen on the motorcycles hopscotch, right, leapfrog, from one light to the next, holding back the traffic so that the hearse, the people mourning inside, could have a direct route to the cemetery without stopping. And I remember when that would happen, my mom would always pull over the car, and she would say to us, "Say a little prayer right now. Say a little prayer for the families that are heading to the cemetery." Our lives stopped in the midst of death. But I was surprised later on in seminary to find out that the ancient rabbis, had kind of a different thought on this whole thing. It was written that when a funeral procession met a wedding procession, the wedding procession had the right-of-way, because they would say, life always has the right-of-way over death. Life always has the right-of-way over death. And this morning in the gospel, as the widow walks with the funeral procession, Jesus is moving toward her. He doesn't turn away. He's not afraid of death. He wants this collision. He sees her fear of the future. He sees her pain. And she doesn't ask anything of Jesus. She stands there, maybe paralyzed in her own grief. We don't know. But as he stands before her, he looks at her with compassion. And this compassion in Greek is a gut-wrenching sympathy, a sympathy that almost makes you sick. And this compassion is always filled with mercy, with action toward the other person. So Jesus can't stand still in the face of death. He can't. So he stops it. He breaks all the purity codes. He breaks all the rules. And he defiles himself by touching the bear with his hand. He reaches out and touches it. And when he does, he transforms death into life itself, telling the young man, "Arise." After he brings the man to life, he gives him to his mother. Yes, the man has been brought to life, but the woman, the widow, who was going to be destitute, her life is also restored too. Jesus cares deeply about that. His compassion, his mercy, the grace made that happen. And the crowds that are there become one crowd now. They're all saying, "Look at him, he heals. We believe he raises people from the dead. He's the Messiah. See the signals? God has looked favorably upon his people. God has come to help his people. God in Jesus Christ, incarnate, has entered the anguish of parental grief. God was with them, and God is with us. And it has been that way with God always. We heard earlier the reading, the prophet Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. And isn't it that way for you and I today? We all are in need of healing. We're all in need of having the death in us restored to life. Some of you know the pain of bearing a child. Others deal with living deaths, like life-threatening illnesses, maybe cancer or a heart condition. Or maybe it's a broken relationship with a loved one, with a wife, with a son, with a brother, a sister. Or maybe it's addiction or a haunting memory of childhood abuse. And although we don't see the dead rise today, even in the midst of our desperate, desperate cries, and that can make us, maybe wonder about these resurrection stories in 2016. But if we really look around in our lives today, in this room, we know we have witnessed life restored in our own lives and in the lives of the people we love. What this story tells us about Jesus over and over again is that Jesus isn't afraid to meet us in those dark places in our lives, those places where we're dead, those places where we're hurt, those places we hide from people. Jesus isn't afraid to meet us there in those untouchable places. In fact, that's where Jesus collides in our life. That's where Jesus is. Christianity is a faith with Christ who enters into death. Jesus enters into death with us. And even when we don't know what to ask for, he's there. I remember years later sitting in a hearse, driving toward my mother's grave, getting ready to bury her after she'd suddenly died in a car accident. I remember sitting in that hearse thinking about all the people who helped me in the middle of all that. I don't know how it happened. All of a sudden laundry was done, meals were there, people were taking my children to school. I hadn't asked for any of it. Pure grace given by loving friends. And I looked out the window, and there were people standing, waving, praying for me. And I thought about my mother's faith and the compassion, her compassion in those moments earlier in my childhood. As people of faith, as the body of Christ, we are called to have that same gut-wrenching compassion for others. We're called to join the procession of life with Jesus, the procession that brings hope to places that are despair, joy where there's hurt and heartache. We can choose to dwell on death or pass it by or stay blind to the weeping widows that we see. or we can see that from time to time there is death in life. That's what we're doing today in the baptism, the promise that when you die, you are reborn again into the life of baptism, into the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we have to live to share love, live to be Christ to each other in this life. In all these meetings of life and death, there is one, Jesus Christ, who reaches out when we can't reach, whose touch brings life and resurrection, who meets us on our way and meets us in all those intersections of our lives so that we don't need to fear death, that fear doesn't have to have a grip on us because life always has the right of way over death. Thanks be to God.